Welcome to the session on A Lasting Legacy, Dr. Herman Cohen's Lifetime of Influence in the History of Speech Communication. My name is David Kratos Williams from Florida Atlantic University, and it's my pleasure to be able to chair this session. I will introduce the speakers as we proceed. At the end, for a question and answer period, I would invite you to use the microphone in the aisle so that your question will be recorded. The first paper today is by Don Boileau from George Mason University, and his title is Applying Hugh Blair's Theory of Taste to the Basic Public Speaking Course. Don?
My first day of graduate work in speech at the University of Oregon in September 1964 began with 18th century British rhetorical theory by Dr. Herman Cohen. In he came. No one ever looked and sounded to me like a university professor than Dr. Cohen. Tweed coat, pipe, smoked all through the seminar session, or several times, which he had to relight all the time and be able to deal with that. Mustache, glasses, physical aspects, but the tone of what happened that day and subsequently was that he screamed out in a way that was, here is a learned person. The rest of the term only reinforced that image. A true university professor, integrating the search for knowledge by being knowledgeable. My introduction to Hugh Blair and the theory of taste began with Cohen's course. I discovered that Cohen, as an assistant professor of speech, had a noted article in the Quarterly Journal of Speech on Hugh Blair's theory of taste. Always an important thing for a graduate student. Find the great article and read it. I still have the article, and I still have my notes from it to be able to deal with that. These ideas in that class bridged my logos-centered world of debate and the success recently of Kennedy's inaugural address and Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. It wasn't the argument of King or Kennedy, but it was, to me, the idea that was presented in Blair's work. Cohen urged us to think about the role that Blair has in urging us to think about the beauties of nature and art by considering how taste is a receptive or a critical power. As a graduate student expecting to teach public speaking, the idea occurred to me in that seminar that this idea of taste is a concept I needed to investigate. Fast forward 50 years, and here I am reading the article saying, now how will that affect my teaching of public speaking? I retired June 1st. But I was finally saying, I can return to something that Cohen exposed me to. So I'd like to give you a summary of Cohen's article and then ways to apply the principles and assignments in public speaking. Hugh Blair was a Presbyterian minister in the Church of Scotland. Through the urging of Lord Kames, ended up publishing his lectures on rhetoric and bell let in 1783. That's about the birth of our country. This work was the first British theory in which someone addressed directly oral communication, particularly in the realms of deliberative oratory, judicial speaking, and pulpit oratory. Cohen argued that, quote, much of Blair's theory is firmly rooted in the classicists. His theory is essentially that of an 18th century school of taste, end of quote. Blair defined taste as the power of receiving pleasure from the beauties of nature and art. Cohen points out that Blair sees the characteristics of taste are found in delicacy, which leans toward feeling and sensibility, as well as correctness, which leans toward reason and judgment. For rhetoricians, the importance of taste is not in being a popular standard, but it actually means to allow something beyond just reason itself. Cohen argues that to Blair, quote, taste seems closely allied to a feeling or a sense that is then a process of the mind. Blair does not ignore reason, but sees reason as assisting taste in its operation, while also serving to enlarge its power. Taste goes about analyzing such things as factors as style, organization, and delivery, as well as the complete work. Thus, both detail and a gestalt response. Cohen notes that Blair perceived two reasons for the inequalities of taste. First, the variance may come from an inherited sensibility, but more important, inferior or superior taste stems from education and culture itself. Blair's compromise perceives a faculty which is fundamentally innate, but which is subject to great improvement through the operation of environmental factors, in Cohen's view. This improved view of taste was also seen, according to Cohen, in Hume, Burke, and Kames. But Blair also argued for the existence of a difference between a diversity of taste and an error in taste. Thus, for the teacher, Cohen argues that we need to be aware of Blair's assertions that what interests the imagination and touches the heart pleases all ages and nations. Blair's universalism of values strikes based on the educated person who can make sophisticated judgments about rhetorical products that reflect a society. Today, we're talking about a global society. A product of enlightenment, Blair's work of 47 lectures on rhetoric had 140 different printings and translations for 4 different languages on the continent. With the arrival of the Victorian era, with its many rules to approach clarity of decision-making, and the emphasis on logic that Whately presented, Blair began to lose popularity with the arrival of the Victorian era. In the spirit of Herman Cohen, I'd like to propose 2 current examples, which were always typical of his class. He'd find something in what was modern and make us really wrestle with those examples. And so I chose 2 examples I've had to wrestle with this year. The first one is both a local example and a national one, and that's the use of the Redskins as a logo in the Washington NFL team. As well as in Fort Collins, Colorado, there's been an argument and demonstrations around the opening of a restaurant called Immigrant Pete, the name being offensive to some in the community. So how do we make this leap to the modern day basic public speaking course? Before one labels my suggestions along the way as hypocritical, because I directed a basic course for 7 years, recall that I knew that someday I would have to do this application of taste, and I finally got around to it. I'm dividing these comments into guiding principles and specific assignments. The most important aspect of Blair's theory is its grounding in the necessity of general education. Herman Cohen represented that grounding in general education. Taste is not what is just popular, but that taste rests a certain natural and instinctive sensitivity to beauty, which reason assists and expands upon. The expectation that one understands nature, and nature was considered different than it is now to be able to deal with that, but nature as science in its background, and art's background, much more than just performance, but in the values that it talks about, and reason, philosophy, and logic. One has to understand that our teachers have to grasp this role within general education. Blair illustrated his ideas with a discussion of Demosthenes, Cicero, and Aeschines as important orators. And that reflected on his knowledge, very detailed knowledge of history, to be able to do that. Cohen noted how Blair's theory of taste emerges as a few generalized principles which create a sensitivity to a response rather than a long list of rules. The second principle is in the creation of substantive vocabulary that undergirds taste. Thus, we need to talk about terms such as delicacy, correctness, innate faculties, feeling, sensibility, and politeness, things that we purposely seem to avoid today. But if you looked at the work in civility, these terms are part of that in different ways and manifest in different authors talking about civility. Reason is not ignored in the basic course, but it does not have the major role that Cohen and even Blair would give it in order to undergird taste. If you use the two examples mentioned earlier, the instructor needs to realize that in most political discourse today, the sides break down into opposing camps that argue only their views and explore their views rather than asking what would be in good taste. For example, in my application, the Redskins would be a term that I would change because the nature of what would be just what I would consider by using an analysis of taste. The example of Immigrant Pete would not be, because the term in the restaurant and what's being argued in Fort Collins is greater than just trying to be a slur and it's actually a celebration of immigrants. Clearly, taste would require listening to the other side in ways that might lead to compromise. For example, if the instructor asks a question about how he would handle a controversy in a matter of integrating the inherited sensibility of these situations with the perspective of what is the impact of delicacy and correctness, the discussion would change in a different who is right or who is wrong to be able to deal with these whatever the question of controversy is. I would like to finish with talking about Cohen as a model of a good professor. During my 40-plus years of teaching, 2 incidents involving Herman Cohen became guiding pedagogical principles for me. One day in class, he was amazed at our lack of historical context that the class had about the changes in the British monarchy. Next period came, and he had a very elaborate chart covering 300 years. And we spent the whole hour discussing the difference of, what is the rise of the Scottish kings and how did that change, all the things about British history. It was really, to me, it was wonderful as a history minor. The second thing was after a summer of research in Scotland, he gave a graduate student, Joyce Harms, a first shot at his discoveries in the archives and encouraged her to use the material to be able to deal with that in a way that was a real gift that made her master's thesis. That model of sensitivity to students I've tried to follow. I'd like to close with a few lines from Edwin Markham's poem, Lincoln, the Man of the People. This is the concluding verse. And to me, when we're talking about Lincoln, I can put Herman Cohen in this place. He held his place. He held the long purpose like a growing tree, held on through blame and faltered not at praise. And when he fell in a whirlwind, he went down as when a lordly cedar, green with boughs, goes down with a great shout upon the hills and leaves a lonesome place against the sky.
Thank you, Don. The second paper today is by David Dyskalski from Penn State University. The title of the paper is Hugh Blair and the Problem of Tragedy. David could not be with us today. The paper will be presented by Maureen Manelli from Kingsborough Community College in New York.
I'm going to apologize for my rapid delivery rate because I just realized David's paper is 5 pages long, but in 10-point font and not 12. Not alone among the Scottish philosophers of this day, Hugh Blair considered the problem of tragedy. As Blair asks in Lecture 45 of his lectures on rhetoric and belles lettres, how does it come to pass that those emotions of sorrow, which tragedy excites, afford any gratification to the mind? Following Blair's advice in a footnote to the question, this essay consults Campbell's Philosophy of Rhetoric, Lord Kames' essays on the principles of morality, and David Hume's essay on tragedy, along with Blair's own lectures, to answer the question and to place the answer in conversation with later aesthetic theories influenced by the aforementioned Scottish theorists. It will surprise no one that taste figures prominently in the answer to the question. But, as the next several pages will show, the path from the pleasure of tragedy to the explanation of taste takes many turns through definition, psychology, literature, rhetoric, melodrama, and the sublime. First, let us begin with some definitions. By tragedy, we are referring to a dramatic literary form of any type that depicts suffering that is a result of character flaw or of overwhelming force. It produces strong emotional responses in audiences, such as pity or fear. It is valued as high literature and is prized, often, for its literary rather than rhetorical merit. Tragedy, in the sense of the catastrophe, that is the denouement of classical Greek drama, is different from the literature of disaster, that is newspaper reporting, the modern novel, and eyewitness accounts of terrible events, according to Heilman. Naturally, we take no pleasure in the suffering of others, but we are fascinated by depictions of distant suffering that produce in us feelings of compassion and pity that are conducive to individual and political action, according to Boltanski. On the one hand, we have literature, artful expression leading us to experience emotion or an aesthetic response. On the other hand, we have polemic, artful expression leading us to action. Our attention and interest, as well as the social conditions and consequences of public or mass media depictions, put tragic discourse in the realm of rhetoric. Public judgment and political action are the end, sometimes, or the result of tragic discourse. Tragedy is often discussed in contrast to comedy, another literature that performs its functions through ridicule rather than pity and fear. Tragedy is also contrasted with melodrama, a simpler, popular form that, often dismissed as cheap thrills, nonetheless performs social functions similar to those of tragedy. Given these complications, it will surprise no one to learn that the pleasure of tragedy is still a contemporary conundrum. The defense of tragedy takes several forms. A compensatory model balances the pain of sorrow against the pleasure of language, going so far as to argue that rhetoric, in the sense of well-turned rhetorical devices, allows unpleasant truths to be considered. In the modern version, cinematic beauty allows audiences to tolerate insufferable characters, the photography in Hitchcock's Vertigo, and the editing of The Social Network by David Fincher and Aaron Sorkin. These compensate audiences enough that they not only watch despicable characters, they learn from their mistakes. David Hume argued that pain can be converted into pleasure through changes in the intensity, changes made possible by the reminder that the play is just fiction. Hume, both George Campbell and Henry Holmes, Lord Kames, took issue with this approach. A hedonistic model privileges the worth of knowledge gained about the human condition over the discomfort of unpleasant emotions. Sandra Shapshay, writing in the British Journal of Aesthetics 2 years ago, mentioned the familiar names of David Hume and Edmund Burke, along with Schopenhauer and more recent philosophers who were concerned with the contradiction of tragedy. Her reclamation of Schopenhauer leads through an appreciation of the pleasure of knowledge to a pleasure based in the sublime, that complex uplift of humility and pride that accompanies the depiction of someone rising to the occasion in the face of awe-inducing natural or social forces. George Campbell also recognized the power of the sublime in poetry, which he saw as a branch or mode of rhetoric. But he also refuted Hume's claims that the very eloquence with which melancholy was presented explained the problem of tragedy by asking, simply, how? Campbell also rejected Dubos's idea that we delight when someone needs a hug, and David's footnote says, yes, he actually used the word hug. Fontenelle's idea that pleasure and pain are interchangeable and differ in degree, such as tickling, by pointing out instances where there makes no sense at all, such as a gross and public insult becoming pleasure if it is only a small offense or a minor neglect. And Malmesbury's idea that the fiction of the theater allows us to indulge in the self-love that the catastrophe is not happening to us. Rather, George Campbell allows that catastrophe to produce sympathy in the form of pity, which activates a constellation of related emotions, commiseration, benevolence, and love, that permits pleasurable exercise of these humane affections. Lord Kames rejected the proposals that any emotion, even pity or fear, was preferable to boredom or that hedonists privilege self-love. In other words, gratitude that the catastrophe is not happening to me is a lesser emotion than pity. He anticipated evolutionary psychology by suggesting that we cannot be adverse to sympathy, for the simple reason that society relies on the sympathy, and, were we to reject sympathy, we would be rejecting the social institutions that make human life possible. Instead, Keynes proposes that we want to know others, and we go to theater to know others, knowing that we know them best when we learn about them in the arms of tragedy. Histories, it turns out, perform a similar function, but history takes too long. Keynes notes the obvious, that it is proper to feel bad for a friend who has suffered some loss, and proper to feel good that you feel bad when you should. According to the social principle, Keynes asserts that tragedy is good for the well-to-do, so that they will know about those who suffer in ways that the well-to-do do not. Finally, Keynes observes that executions and other public spectacles excite the vulgar, but other entertainments, such as prize fights, allow those with refined taste to feel identical with the bravery of the victor and at the same time feel sympathy for the vanquished. On the matters of refined taste, we return to Hugh Blair and Herman Cohen's analysis of taste and rhetoric and belles lettres. According to Dr. Cohen, Dr. Blair was the only Scottish rhetorician to discuss taste as part of rhetoric. Campbell and Whately ignored it, and Keynes, who was highly influential in Blair's theory of taste, did not discuss it in terms of speech-making. Blair's view of taste was also quite similar to that of David Hume and Edmund Burke. Taste, as the power of receiving pleasure from the beauties of nature and art, was not a product of the understanding, but could be enlarged by reason, influenced by education and culture, and improved through practice. Everyone possesses some measure of taste, whether coarse or refined, as a natural ability to respond with delicacy and correctness to a work of art. The standard of judgment allows for some variety among individuals, but it is founded on agreement by individuals in general on the merits of a work as both an accurate depiction of reality and a depiction that is, itself, well constructed. History is one guide for taste, in that some objects of admiration have stood the test of time, and a well-functioning society is another guide, in that such societies have sustained themselves through good judgment, whether political or artistic. The social and political aspects of tragedy are important, and we will turn to them after reflecting on Blair's own answer to the question of the problem of tragedy. His answer, in fact, also leads us to the social and political aspects of tragedy. Quite in agreement with his contemporaries, Blair admits that the pleasure of language and the beauty of action are part of the appeal in tragedy, as is the mixture of pleasure and pain, along with the relief of knowing that tragedy is only fiction. But more so than his contemporaries, Blair observes that pity, or compassion, which must be caused by some distress, also awakens benevolence, friendship, kindness, sympathy for humanity, and love. These affections prevail and are strengthened by the recognition that we are responding properly. In contrast to later Freudian notions that the catharsis of tragedy purges unpleasant emotions from the psyche, Blair's sense of catharsis is that it transcends the pain of sorrow by embracing the better versions of ourselves that are capable of sympathetic affections. The social and public sources of tragic feeling and the social and public standards of judgment about the quality of tragic discourse return us to the realm of rhetoric. More than just the well-turned phrase that turns suffering into a delicacy for aesthetics, rhetoric is political, and it turns suffering into a spur for action. Drama, too, is political in rhetoric. Turning drama into melodrama intensifies his feelings of benevolence, friendship, kindness, sympathy for humanity, and love in public life. The ancient Greeks understood drama as a mechanism of public life, not as a literary experience. Heilmann's even-handed treatment of tragedy and melodrama maintains an elitist distinction between tragedy as art and melodrama as entertainment without privileging tragedy. More recently, efforts have been made to rehabilitate melodrama entirely. In maintaining the usual distinction between drama as contemplative literature and melodrama as active polemic, Heilmann adds an intriguing qualification: tragedy is to religion as melodrama is to politics. His description of melodrama is remarkably similar to our understanding of political rhetoric. And it would seem that the function of rhetoric is to take what is tragic in real life and move it out of the realm of religion and contemplation and into the realm of politics and action, We see this clearly in Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, as the great American tragedy is turned into an aspiring dream in which distress also awakens benevolence, friendship, kindness, sympathy for humanity, and love. King's speech is, of course, both melodrama and Baptist sermon. Hugh Blair, as we know, had much to say about the sermon as a genre of rhetoric. But that essay will have to wait for another time and on another occasion, with which we will remember the work of our beloved Blair scholar, Herman Cohen.
Our next paper is by Brian Horakami from Salisbury University. The title of the paper is Precursors to Modern Intercultural Communication, International Cultural and Co-Cultural Communication Studies between 1940 and 1959. Brian?
Herman Cohen asserted and warned us in his introduction to his book, The History of Speech Communication, The Emergence of a Discipline, 1914 to 1945, and said the following: "The lack of historical consciousness has had serious consequences for the profession. To borrow a term from anthropology, we are a deracinated people who are unaware of our roots. Like deracinated peoples, we periodically reinvent our histories, and each time they are different," end quote. His contribution to the field as our historian laureate preserved many of the proceedings, meetings, and developments of the various tracks that current programs in communication arts and sciences have now established and maintained. As a tribute to Dr. Cohen's contributions to our discipline, this paper respectfully emulates his dedication to the history of communication by offering a survey of what scholars in our field were investigating between the 1940s and the late 1950s in the context of culture and communication. The impetus for this historical analysis was prompted by the commonly referenced origin of modern intercultural communication studies to Edward T. Hall and his work in training overseas diplomats through the Foreign Service Institute of the United States State Department. Interest in intercultural communication began after World War II, when business and government employees were having difficulties dealing with people in the cultures they were assigned to live and work in across various parts of the world. Similar to how Herman Cohen claimed that English departments were the keepers of rhetoric for speech communication in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the cultural anthropologists of the 1950s revitalized the field by establishing a foothold to intercultural communication. Prior to this turning point in the discipline, scholars in the United States were examining the role of cultural differences in various contexts of communication. What follows is an overview of published articles in the national and regional academic journals of that period. The analysis for this project examined the contents of published articles from the Quarterly Journal of Speech, Western Speech, Speech Monographs, and Speech Teacher between 1940 and 1959. Although this database is not comprehensive, it represented the topics that related to culture that were significant during that era. 3 topics emerged from the investigation. These included, number 1, interpretive and critical accounts of communicative behaviors in various international cultures. 2, international relations in multi-organizational forums and within specific countries. And 3, accounts of oratory and cultural behaviors of Native Americans and African Americans. For the purpose of this presentation, I will focus on 2 areas: the international arena and studies on American ethnic groups. 2 examples of rhetorical traditions represent communication behaviors in international contexts, one in ancient Babylon and the other in dynastic Korea. In 1957, Gerald Phillips wrote about the rhetorical implications in the Talmud in the ancient Middle East of Babylon and Palestine. He wrote in the Quarterly Journal of Speech, "The Talmud achieved the status of a legal code for Jews, providing doctrine and procedure in civil and criminal law, and rules for family relationships and religious observances." He concluded that the Talmudic oral culture was an implicitly rhetorical tradition that employed all 5 canons of Western rhetoric. Not very long after Phillips, Robert T. Oliver, who was then the head of the Department of Speech at the Pennsylvania State University, published an historical account of the various schools that formed during Korea's Yi dynasty that spanned from 1392 to 1910. He described which canons of Western rhetoric were prominent in the 5 major schools that gained vibrant growth during the centuries that were led by the Yi dynasty. Likewise, Phillips conducted his analysis of the Talmudic rabbis in similar ways. The juxtaposition of Western and Eastern approaches in human communicative behaviors continued through the modern period of intercultural communication as well. The second theme that emerged was the portrayal of co-cultures in the United States. Selections representative scholarship during this period on the accounts of oratory and cultural behaviors of Native Americans and African Americans range from linguistic analyses and positive portrayals on the eloquence of members in these cultures. In the manuscript by Lois Buswell on the eloquence of the Dakota Indians, an elaborated description of the stylistic aspects of oratory was inventoried. The portrayals of Native Americans appeared to be very praiseworthy. In addition, there was a cluster of articles in the absence of stuttering in the Native Americans that hinted towards studies into speech science. Variables such as birth injury, handedness and change of handedness, and parenting styles were causal factors that resulted in stuttering. These reports were primarily descriptions of the population and the fact that there were no signs of stuttering in this group. For instance, James Sindacor wrote in the Quarterly Journal of Speech on the Bannock and Shoshone tribes of Idaho that he interviewed over 800 Indians and failed to find one pure-blooded Indian who stuttered. However, the exception was one full-blooded Indian woman was reported as a stutterer, and it was said that she stuttered when sober, but never when drunk. Clearly, he had a sense of humor. In line with the previous journals surveyed in this paper, the contributions of African Americans focused on eloquence in preaching. For example, William Honan wrote about a slave-born preacher from Richmond, Virginia, named John Jasper, that unpacked his sermon that moved the sun. Honan wrote, "John Jasper held that the sun revolved around the earth. He proved it literally by the Bible, personally with the force and faith of his own conviction, and rhetorically with a sermon of unparalleled passion and vigor. Word of it instantly captured the imagination of all Richmond, bringing enormous crowds of white and colored people to Jasper's church." Like other rhetorical critics of the day, Honan employed the traditional canons of rhetoric, the audience, and effects to uncover the effectiveness of Jasper's oratorical prowess. This historical survey of journal articles published in the speech communication journals prior to what scholars claim to be the origin of modern intercultural communication studies yielded 3 thematic groupings, 2 of which I emphasize today. On the basis of this analysis, 2 aspects were salient. There was a prominence among the journal articles of understanding the other culture through a Western and classical lens. This was a reasonable finding because speech communication at the time employed classical canons and the Aristotelian model as tools. What resulted was an imposed structure on artifacts that did not fit easily or effectively to understand the points of view of the other culture. A second observation regarding the scholarship of the time was in the context of public oratory. It was not until the modern intercultural communication period that studies began to consider the daily interactions of the people examined. Absent were studies on relational communication between members of the international or co-culture. Moreover, there were no published chapters on how people in the United States interacted with people from other cultural backgrounds, despite the fact that these encounters did occur. Interestingly, what was the domain of communication, both verbal and nonverbal, were held for us in other disciplines such as history and anthropology. One limitation of this paper was that it only focused on a handful of academic journals published by a select number of professional organizations during that period. A more comprehensive examination of more journal titles, books, diaries, and other texts that represented the research agendas of the day would prove to be a stronger, more historically accurate treatment that emulates the true life's work of Dr. Herman Cohen. This tribute paper delimited its parameters to a single area of our discipline in a span of 20 years. The significant lesson in this is such. Even though speech communication might have come from deracinated origins, if students and scholars perpetuate the history of ideas of communication studies by continuing a steady account and review of our discipline's past, we will ensure a bright sense of our discipline's identity in the future. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you. The next paper is by Calvin Trobe from Duquesne University. The title is Presence and Prescience, a note on Herman Cohen's 1975 presidential address. He could not be with us either today, and this paper will be presented by his colleague from Duquesne, Janie Harden Fritz.
I'm pleased to have the opportunity to speak on behalf of Calvin Trobe today about his beloved mentor. We're sailing in high seas in academia today with more uncertainty than most of us have seen in our academic careers. Perhaps Herman Cohen, a historian of the field and a historian of rhetoric, can help us find our bearings. What a pleasure it would be to invite him once more into the conversation. He rarely missed a meeting of what we now call the National Communication Association. We miss him profoundly at this one. As Neil Postman suggests, we do our best work standing on the shoulders of others. Dr. Cohen provides sturdy intellectual shoulders and a sound mind between them, from which he taught many of us so well. He professed an unwavering commitment to the primacy of human liberty, the virtue of liberality, and the practices essential to basic human freedom. Cohen's formative contributions tempt us to speculate on what he might say now. I will attempt to avoid this speculative trap. Instead, I seek simply to listen, interpret, and respond well to Dr. Cohen's words to the purpose of contributing in some small way to our deliberations on the future of the National Communication Association. In this essay, I will first identify some key themes from Cohen's 1975 Speech Communication Association presidential address. Next, I will correlate themes from the presidential address with some dominant themes in Cohen's scholarship. Finally, I will offer considerations for today. I trust that the attempt will honor his memory as a professor, scholar, and advisor worth emulating. In his 1975 SCA speech, Cohen offers an argument on future courses of action for NCA. I note two major concerns voiced by Cohen in the presidential address and his basic response to these concerns from the heart of the rhetorical tradition. Cohen speaks at the end of the 60s. The times were tumultuous for society and for higher education. First, SCA faced a real threat of schism. The United States added 450 community colleges in the 1960s, expanding into a national network of schools. This spurred growth in SCA with the addition of community colleges, regional state universities, and high school educators. Meanwhile, elite academic institutions were pushing to put communication on equal footing with other disciplines. Cohen's response leans into the problem with a both-and mindset. He says, there is no reason why our field cannot be both scholarly and professional. Cohen calls for professional generosity and intellectual humility with a scholar-teacher mindset. Deliberating on the problems, Cohen owns his own biases in a department associated with elite scholarship and asserts, we need to understand the problems of classroom teachers, and more importantly, we need to listen to them. They have advice to offer us. We must not assume that we will always be consulted as experts. Cohen believes that our more basic shared practices involve listening and learning from other human beings, that enhancing human communication in the real world through teaching and scholarship is a worthy but difficult charge. Secondly, he calls the association to public communicative action. He asks SCA to devote itself to a multi-partisan approach to citizen training and societal commitments to free and open public democratic deliberation. In the wake of Watergate and Vietnam, Cohen worries that SCA has become insular, eroding a historical commitment of communication scholars to attend to the climate of communication. Professional refinement and advances in research have distanced SCA members from meaningful engagement in their own society. He objects to SCA taking positions on issues of partisan politics, believing that the public work of communication scholars on the communication climate supersedes partisanship. Not tending to conditions for communication will negate the rhetorical tradition of the loyal opposition. Therefore, Cohen argues that we need to speak to government and to politicians about their common misconduct. What is Cohen's 1975 response to the threat of schism and the deterioration of the public communication climate? Cultivate democratic deliberation. He does not expect simple, tidy, or happy discussions in the association, but he insists that the association's health depends on shared commitments. Deliberating a good course is not merely procedural. Cohen worries that deliberative democracy is at risk. He would have the association work publicly to sustain public commitments to the belief that strong, deliberative institutions preserve democracy. On questions of public deliberation, one way to distinguish perspectives is to ask Aristotle's question: is democracy the behavior that democracies want, or the behavior that preserves and protects democracy? As a scholar, Cohen responded clearly, the behavior that preserves and protects democracy is the rhetoric of democratic deliberation. And Cohen's leadership corresponded to his scholarship. Cohen's research in Scottish Enlightenment rhetoric, particularly his work on Hugh Blair, led him to favor rigorous democratic deliberation to the purpose of building democratic freedom. A synopsis of Cohen's argument goes like this. First, a major question on rhetoric is whether public deliberation is a cause of human liberty or a symptom of human liberty secured by other means. In Cohen's research, Charles Rollin argued that a good state provided the conditions from which rhetorical deliberation could emerge. Liberty was a gift granted by a good state. Rollin was a foil against which to introduce Hugh Blair. Blair believed rhetorical deliberation to be the engine of democratic freedoms, the ground of human liberty, and the source of sound government. Cohen's priorities in the 1975 presidential address resonate deeply with his scholarship. Looking to the future, Cohen predicates his hopes for the association and the society on robust rhetorical practices. In his own day, Cohen addressed directly the basic question he learned from Hugh Blair: NCA to what purpose? He did not value the existence of the association for its own sake. Rather, he believed in the work of NCA for the purpose of securing liberty deliberately. Democratic rhetorical deliberation formed the ground from which the field of communication and our professional societies must emerge. Therefore, Cohen called us to practice deliberation as an association, to teach communication through which to build communities, cultures, and societies that deliberate well, and to advance and protect deliberative government nationally by contributing to the public conversation concerning what he called the communication climate. Currently, the momentum driving the National Communication Association seems to be moving away from its roots toward becoming a thoroughly modern organization that exists to secure professional legitimacy and to exercise national political influence in the halls of power. As a recent issue of Spectra suggests, the real action for NCA and by NCA is in Washington, D.C. According to modern association management techniques, member deliberation is an obstacle to association progress. Members should want a technocracy that conforms to professional norms and best practices of effective association management. Once the proper institutional forms are established, deliberation can proceed as a performance necessary to make members feel involved and to generate member buy-in for important association decisions. In tribute to the spirit and work of Herman Cohen, I would prefer to inhabit the role of loyal opposition on this question. We must practice, protect, and preserve in our own community the means necessary to work as a professional and public society, with freedom of speech as the backbone. Shall we argue for academic freedom in our institutional homes only to abandon it at NCA? We would do well to forsake modern efficiency, effectiveness, and antiseptic conformity, and welcome the bustle, the mess, and the inefficient drama of open deliberation from all quarters and all members who choose to speak. The current trajectory of NCA is moving in the direction of Rollin, not Blair. We seem to be erecting a modern monument to the academic conformity that forsakes the content of academic freedom, even as we attempt to retain its style. Modernity never risks the organization, but at just the wrong time. We reckon to risk the people, our association, and our society. We can never know what Herm Cohen would do if he were leading NCA in this moment. That would be sheer speculation. But in tribute to him and in honor of his memory, we can remember what he taught us, both by his words and by his deeds. And we are grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next paper is by Maureen Minnelli, and she will deliver her own paper as well. The title is The Academic Study of Rhetoric from 1946 to 1960, Exploring Our History in Honor of Herman Cohen.
It's with a lot of love, but a lot of sadness that I'm delivering this paper. Herman Cohen originally intended to write a second book on the history of the discipline. I think his original intentions were to write about the years 1946 to 1970 in Wingspread, or at least that's what I suggested when I wrote my doctoral comp answer to this question for him. I left Penn State in 1993, but continued to do my grad work for him, sending him articles about the discipline during this time frame through fax, email, and snail mail. When I acquired Dr. Cohen's papers from his family this past March, I was surprised to see that he had saved not only the research that I had done as his grad assistant on the first book, but all of the articles I had sent him for the second one, complete with my posted notes including content summaries, pages to examine, and the occasional sarcastic comment of biasness towards the social sciences. After doing this preliminary research for him, he realized that the discipline had expanded, diversified, and changed so much to the point that writing the next installment would be a monumental task. Not only had the discipline grown, the amount of reference information had grown exponentially as well. For his first book, Cohen's research landscape was rather limited. He already had a good base of knowledge of English from his previous experiences. For his book, he focused his research primarily in three areas: Quarterly Journal of Speech, speech monographs, and textbooks. It is the same approach that I'm using for my paper. From these two journals, I examined the essays produced under a broad interpretation of the word rhetoric from 1946 to 1960. That interpretation resulted in the following subjects: ancient rhetoric, argumentation, persuasion, political communication, presidential rhetoric, public address, public speaking, rhetorical theory, and rhetorical criticism. For this period, the results of the article count see the subject of public address as the most populous with 124 essays, followed by rhetorical theory at 46, then public speaking, ancient rhetoric, presidential rhetoric, argumentation, persuasion, and political communication at 7. As such, while rhetorical criticism to be the favored scholarly activity during this time, there was growing discontent with the approach of neo-Aristotelian criticism that helped generate new essays that are being produced. And in addition, we see works coming out thanks to the work of Marie Hochmuth Nichols. She's the one who brought to the forefront of scholarly attention the works of Kenneth Burke and I.A. Richards in the 1950s. It is through this development that we can see that the rhetorical theory side starts to develop and start to complement what's been done in rhetorical criticism. So I want to start with the years 1946 to 1949. A review of the predominant topics in our journals at the time include presidential rhetoric, public address and public speaking in Quarterly Journal of Speech, and public address and rhetorical theory and speech monographs. The presence of rhetorical theory is particularly noteworthy. In 1946, the National Association for the Teachers of Speech changed their name to the Speech Association of America. As the field grew between 1946 and 1960, the number of scholars also grew, from a membership of a little over 4,000 in 1947 to 7,700 in 1959. These scholars continued to debate how to pursue communication study with a desire to define its province. The divide between the traditionalists and the social scientists continued to widen, a debate that had started when we broke away from English in 1914. While his paper focuses on rhetoric, it's important to note that the rhetorical schism deepened and became more prominent during this 14-year span and mirrored an even larger schism that was occurring within the greater speech communication discipline. Becker points out in 1989 that rhetorical studies based on the claims of classical rhetoric were popular during the 1940s and 1950s. Charlie Stewart in 1973 points out that the time frame between 1946 and 1960, scholars engaged in rhetorical criticism, they began to question the predominant practice that had resulted from Will Chelton's 1925 essay, The Literary Criticism of Oratory. Now referenced colloquially as the cookie-cutter approach to rhetorical criticism, communication scholars began to resist the one orator, one speech approach and the end goal of criticism, namely effect. 1947 was a seminal year that illuminated the internal tensions regarding rhetorical methodology and critical practices, as there were no less than 5 essays about the subject published in QJS. 1948 is very important because it is the year that speech became formally recognized by the American Council on Education, and by doing so, departments were allowed to grant doctoral degrees or graduate degrees in the field of speech. This formal recognition soon led to the development of graduate programs starting in the early 1950s. The ability to confer degrees beyond the bachelor's signaled a growing acceptance of communication study by acknowledging that our discipline embodied a specific entity of knowledge worthy of an advanced degree. That pivotal moment in our disciplinary history altered the trajectory of speech communication study, and that while rhetoric continued to be an area of emphasis, it soon found itself with new company. So now I want to turn to the decade of 1950 to 1959. During 1950 to 1959, the predominant rhetoric-related topics discussed in the Quarterly Journal of Speech was public address. None of the search terms were found in speech monographs, as speech education was the overwhelming area of emphasis, undoubtedly as a result of the new granting of degrees. Hazen in 2008 states that as the 20th century edged past its halfway point, the state of the communication field in the United States was clearly introspective, with a heavy emphasis on the self-questioning and pessimism. The decade of the 1950s marked an ever-widening schism between the humanists and the social scientists. As I'm sure most of you know, in 1950, there were a group of scholars that broke away from SAA because of the direction that the discipline was taking at the time, and they formed their own association, which is now known as ICA. One reason for the separation, suggests Griffin in 1977, was that most association members continued to regard speech communication as a platform art. The early 1950s saw much discussion at SAA on how to accommodate these two groups, which resulted in the formation of interest groups, which are still with us today at NCA. This decade continued to see the continuation of the traditional approach to rhetorical criticism, of which we could argue Cohen's 1958 paper on Blair and the theory of taste would fall. But this decade heard more dissenting voices advocating for a greater rhetorical study net. They suggested areas including different approaches, artifacts, and goals. One highlight of this decade comes from Marie Hochmuth. While Kenneth Burke had published his thoughts on literary and rhetorical criticism in the early 1950s in QJS, particularly 1952 and 1953, it was through the efforts of Hochmuth that introduced his works to rhetorical scholars. Later in 1958, she introduced a second seminal theorist, I.E. Richards. Ironically, in 1955, Hochmuth continued the legacy of the traditional approach through the publication of the third volume of A History of Criticism of American Public Address. This volume, like the first two published by Berganza in 1943, remained considered as exemplars of the traditional rhetorical study approach advocated by Wilchelms. A second highlight of this decade comes from the pen of J. Jeffrey Auer. In 1959, he published the book An Introduction to Research in Speech, which provides a snapshot of the state of rhetorical studies. And what he did in this book, he analyzed the dissertations and the theses that were being generated at the time and created several broad categories that would define the speech communication discipline. One of those categories was public address. And then from that, he delineated even more specific subcategories of interest, political communication, that type of thing. In addition, he defined three predominant methods for conducting research: historical, descriptive, and experimental, and argued that all three were being used in the study of rhetoric and public address. Overall, Auer argued that each approach should utilize the following criteria in the study: statement of the problem, creation of a working hypothesis, identification and utilization of an appropriate method of analysis, which Auer called research design, the collection and analysis of data, and the conclusion. In his 1975 SCA presidential address, Cohen reflected on the rhetorical studies in the 1950s, which is where his participation began. He said, "Since 1954, when I received my PhD, both our attitudes about our profession, about free and open communication, have radically changed. The view of our field was then much simpler, even simplistic, compared to our present perspective. Some of us, however, fresh from graduate school, thought we were on the cutting edge, so to speak, of the most sophisticated kind of thinking about oral communication. We were, in retrospect, a field largely concerned with the teaching of public speaking and some group discussion. We were in our scholarship much concerned with attempting to explore our historical heritage of speech-making and rhetorical theory. As I look back, we seem to be involved in applying Aristotelian proofs and canons to every conceivable rhetorical event. I'm afraid that such activity told us more about Aristotle than it did about any speech. Our work was pretty unsophisticated, but we had come a long way from the years of the elocutionists. In summary, the middle part of the 20th century encompassed a discipline that was still finding its way and a field of rhetoric that was still calling for expansion. The year 1960. The predominant 1960 topics examined in the Quarterly Journal of Speech and speech monographs were public address and rhetorical theory. The ending point of 1960 may it seem at first blush an odd place to end this paper, and it is. But there is a notable anomaly that makes 1960 a little significant. As I had mentioned earlier, the membership in SAA had been 7,700 in 1959, but in 1960, it dropped to 5,100. So I was curious to decide, I actually wish Dr. Cohen was here to explain why membership dropped by nearly 1/3. In conclusion, in summary, the period between 1946 and 1960 represented introspection, change, and growth. Continuing questions of what directions rhetorical studies should take, including methods, artifacts, and goals, permeated those 14 years. Thank you.
Our final paper in the session today is by Janet Reynolds Bodenman from Bloomsburg University. Her title, The Development of Applied Communication, Expanding the History of Speech Communication in Honor of Herman Cohen.
When I took Dr. Cohen's SpeechComm 597, History of Ideas in Speech Communication, most of the students were studying rhetoric while I was studying organizational communication. Because the goal of the course was to explore the beginnings of the field, Dr. Cohen challenged me to study the development of the discipline from World War II on, which is when the roots of my interests began. When the 17 scholars broke away from English in 1914 and subsequently created the National Association of the Teachers of Speech in 1917, one of the initial discussions resulting from the organization's creation was the future research direction. The discipline engaged in a long debate over humanistic versus the social scientific approaches. When speech communication was born, the majority of the research was conducted in rhetorical theory, public address, and the classics, leaving the research and study of human behavior primarily housed in social psychology. This paper briefly examines one of the more recent offshoots of the social scientific perspective, known as applied communication. Dr. Cohen would have been pleased that we would add the development of applied communication to the discussion, since in the epilogue to his history of the discipline, he states, "The question may certainly be raised about whether the discipline has put a distinctive stamp on its research and teaching. I hope to deal with these kinds of questions in the succeeding volume." We are left to write that succeeding volume, to extend his legacy by reminding others of where we have been. According to the National Communication Association website, applied communication is listed as one of the most common areas of study in the discipline of communication. It is defined as the study of how communication theory research and/or best practices help inform knowledge and theory about communication for practical issues. Many prominent scholars in the field have commented on this area of the discipline, and I cannot do justice to what they share in the length of a convention paper. For this, I have chosen to cover key turning points, or points at which applied communication area paused to reflect and/or created an agenda for future action from its roots to its current state. We can't figure out where we are going without looking at where we have come from. Cohen's History of the Discipline and NCA's website information on history provide good resources for exploring the roots of the areas we currently include in the discipline. As Dr. Cohen notes, the tranquil, if obscure life of speech communication was severely disturbed at the end of World War II. That period represented an intellectual revolution in the social sciences. They moved very rapidly from a descriptive methodological base to a quantitative, empirical, experimental, and behavioral approach to the questions they ask. Many disciplines, such as political science, sociology, economics, anthropology, and geography, underwent radical and rapid change, and we saw considerable conflict and ferment between traditionalists and modernists in many disciplines. The lines between conventional fields became blurred, and a general exchange of conceptualizations and methodologies took place. Sociologists borrowed from political scientists, and geographers contributed to the work of anthropologists. Perhaps most important to us, the scope of social scientists had broadened to include almost all aspects of human behavior, including communication. He goes on to point out that speech communication had slumbered through the early days of the revolution and then awoke to find that social scientists had undertaken systematic studies of human communication and that someone was exploring territory that we should have discovered but had not. In 1946, NATS Association became the Speech Association of America. In 1948, some of the society worried that emerging social science area might get lost, so they asked for a meeting at the Speech Association of America. They formed a group, which is now known as ICA, whose goal was to promote social science research, whose focus would be on having an impact in business communication. Business professionals were brought in to join with academics to focus on effective communication practice. This group moved beyond writing articles on business speaking and began to involve itself in organizational communication. Areas and issues such as interpersonal communication, small group communication, conflict resolution, and leadership were also being discussed in the discipline. In the early days, research was conducted by those outside the field, but speech scholars grew in their sophistication regarding the social sciences in terms of theoretical and methodological development. During the 1960s, a number of academic specialties were beginning, and there was a move towards re-examining the structure of the discipline. Prominent applied scholars mention a pivotal point in the founding of applied communication. At a 1968 New Orleans convention, it is reported that the social scientists took over the discipline, talking about how they would take into account the social science part of the discipline. In 1970, SSA became the Speech Communication Association. The 70s and 80s showed much growth in the discipline, with 3 new journals added, one of which was the Journal of Applied Communications Research, founded in 1973 by Mark Hickson. Hickson's opening article explained that it was important for the field of speech communication to place an emphasis on social relevance. He stated that we must focus on contemporary social and political problems, encouraging the field to do research that becomes a mean to an end and not merely an end in itself. This agenda was set then for those interested in applied communication research for the remainder of his tenure as editor. In 1981, the name of the journal was changed to the Journal of Applied Communication, no S at the end of communication. Since its inception, the journal focused on the theory and practice of communication, especially in contemporary and social issues. The area of applied communication was started in 1976 at SCA in a reorganization of the association. The early applied communications section was made up primarily of professors who were also trainers and of professors who wanted to do applied research, with a few business professionals from outside the discipline completing the group. By the 1990s, applied communication research was being criticized because it appeared that appeared to be a lack of agreed upon meaning of applied communication research, and the 1980s and early 1990s, critics seriously challenged the academic value of applied communication research and the motivations of applied communication researchers. There appeared to be 5 common misconceptions about applied communication research that included it was not grounded in theory, it was conducted only in field settings, it was a form of consultation, it was tied to the use of the survey method, and it was a form of organizational communication research. In the late 90s, in the field of communication, there was a big shift. The applied communication section became a division in 1996, and members who were interested in training and development in organizations became their own division. In 1997, SCA became the National Communication Association, and the last vestiges of speech were removed from its identity. One conclusion that might be drawn from a review of applied communication literature is that much progress was made in the early 1990s in terms of getting an agenda and beginning to develop a wider audience that understood what applied communication research was and the important contributions it could make. In the year 2009, applied communication scholars stated that applied had differentiated itself from the former notions of applied communication and from being known as an extension of organizational communication research. It was suggested that quantitative versus qualitative debate was over, and it now needed to be taken over by a new focus linking rigor and relevance instead. Today, applied communication is an interest group in ECA, in SSCA, and a division at NCA. It does not exist in either the Western or the Central States Communication Associations. A look at the membership of these interest groups and divisions shows that most are academics from four-year universities and that they come from a variety of subdisciplines within the field. The majority have a social scientific training, although more and more use mixed methods in their research. Changes do seem to be occurring, as evidenced by the current mission statement of Applied Communication Division at NCA, and is also reflected in the requirements of the publications of the journal, as well as in what we are seeing in panels throughout the discipline. In terms of how Dr. Cohen would best look at this point, as we learned in our discipline, he said that if our discipline has any hope of becoming identifiable and valued by outsiders, we must make sure that internally we have a clear knowledge of which our thoughts were derived from which disciplines, the adaptations which were made of ideas from other disciplines, the use of which those ideas were put, and the ways in which ideas from other disciplines shaped our field. Then we can determine what is our own and articulate to others what our contributions to humankind can be. Thank you.
Thank you. We now will have some words from our respondent, Dennis Gowron from Penn State University.
In reflecting on my role as a respondent on this panel and recognizing my lack of expertise in any of the specific content areas the other members of the panel have addressed, I concluded that possibly the most useful function I could serve would be to provide a brief assessment of Professor Cohen in terms of a subject with which I do have some knowledge, namely leadership, and more specifically, the brand commonly identified as transformational. Although we typically do not equate teaching with leadership, in its most fundamental sense, it is an activity that involves the exercise of influence and in important senses shapes the intellectual outlook, values, and achievements of those touched by it. From my perspective, Professor Cohen was the very embodiment of the attributes that those most closely identified with the study and illumination of transformational leadership had in mind, as well as how they contrast with those who more clearly qualify as transactional. The former attributes consist of idealized influence, inspirational motivation, intellectual stimulation, and individualized consideration. In contrast to their transactionally oriented counterparts, transformational leaders are not reliant on the use of rewards, promises, threats, and punishments as means by which to exercise influence. In fact, there is some question as to whether transformational leaders even consciously have influence as a motivation in many instances. This is not a question in the case of transactional leaders, so transparent are their motivations. Idealized influence, charisma or referent power, if you prefer, is a quality that draws others to transformational leaders. This was obviously true of Professor Cohen. I am aware of no instance in which he even came close to engaging in the sorts of aggressive, untoward, and ethically questionable recruitment of students as protégés to which I have frequently been witness throughout my professional career. Rather, he drew students to him on the strength of his character, his commitment to intellectual pursuits, and the joy he evinced indulging in them. In Professor Cohen's professional world, sycophancy and discipleship were anathema. If I am in error in this regard, the other members of the panel can set the record straight, but I'm reasonably sure of the accuracy of my observation. Transformational leaders are also characterized by inspirational motivation, which is another way of saying they are visionary. Professor Cohen was visionary, but not necessarily in the conventional sense of the term. For the time that I knew him, he had a vision of a discipline in which all representatives were conscious of its roots, its evolution, and its principal contributions. That it was a vision in which others came to share is evident in the presentations my fellow panelists have just made. The diversity, depth, and range of themes speak for themselves and, in my judgment, constitute evidence of a legacy rich in potential for preserving the past, but also fostering new developments. This seems to be all the more fitting on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the founding of the association. The third attribute, and one often glossed over in discussions of transformational leadership, is intellectual stimulation. Those leaders who succeed in transforming others in the most positive senses of the term place considerable importance on critical reflection when it comes to the adoption and internalization of ideas. They especially eschew the notion that others should be accepting of their own ideas simply by virtue of having generated them, which is always a danger in one's interactions with those who manifest all of the other defining qualities. The Herman Cohen I knew would never have succumbed to ingratiation by his students, nor would he have engaged in the subtle forms of proselytizing to which one is susceptible when he or she privately would like to experience approbation of others, not their criticism or even their reservations. To him, if ideas are worth valuing, they need to withstand critical scrutiny. As with his disdain for sycophancy and discipleship, passive acceptance of ideas was something for which Professor Cohen had little, if any, patience. Finally, transformational leaders, at least those who are authentic, exhibit high levels of individualized consideration. To Professor Cohen, the classroom was merely one site of instruction, and class time constituted but one type of teaching opportunity. His teaching moments were many and varied. They also surfaced in interactions not merely with graduate students, but with undergraduate students and colleagues as well. He was not particular about those with whom he was willing to share his thoughts or when, nor did the provocations or instigations for conversation have to be compelling. A simple greeting in the hallway might be sufficient to trigger a thought that would provoke sustained discussion about something considerably more important than observance of the social norm or ritual that prompted it. I can recall relatively few instances when I passed Professor Cohen's office and failed to notice a visitor with whom he was engaged in interaction, and typically about some matter of intellectual significance. I suspect that several of the other panelists would confirm my observation that if one were talking with Professor Cohen, there was little doubt that he was paying attention and showing interest in what the person had to say. I reached the point at which, on occasions such as this, the observation, "There will never be another," "He was one of a kind," "They broke the mold in his case," or some other such cliche passing as an insight seems to be warranted. Were I to summon one, however, I suspect Professor Cohen, were he with us, might take umbrage, inasmuch as such characterizations run counter to what he saw himself and his mission in professional life to be. That is, contributing to the enlargement of intellectual achievement to whatever extent and whenever possible. This does not, however, preclude the appropriateness of one's characterizing him as a special kind of person. To that end, let me attempt another way of paying tribute. In 2008, I had the privilege of being invited to prepare an essay for an issue of the Pennsylvania Scholars Series, honoring Professor Cohen as historian of the discipline. In closing, I would like to repeat an observation that I made at the time because it continues to capture the esteem I have for my colleague and friend, as well as the regard in which I shall continue to hold it. My late father was fond of applying the label "the genuine article" to those he admired, not only by virtue of their achievements, but also their complete lack of pretentiousness or hint of self-aggrandizement. To him, these were the sorts of people who make a difference and have a positive impact on the well-being of others who are fortunate enough to have encountered them. The labors and selfless love conspicuous in Professor Cohen's career, I am confident, would have led my father, had the two been acquainted, to say of him, "He's the genuine article."
Thank you, and thank the panelists. We have exceeded our allotted time, but I suspect if there are burning questions or comments, we might indulge that moment. Evidently, the panelists have satisfied your curiosities. Thank you very much.